Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Helen Campbell, formerly of DG Interpretation European Commission. Today I'm going to talk to you about Les Misérables. The French are unhappy people. Now, I was in Paris just the other week, and I did indeed notice that people in general don't look too happy, rather impatient, perhaps rather grumpy too, and always complaining. Now, I do refer to Paris here, and I go to other places in France too, where I see a big difference. Paris is a big, bustling city, and people generally are going to be more impatient and bad-tempered in such an environment. But I read an article recently that rather interested me, and which stated that the French indeed are pessimistic and an unhappy crowd of people. I wonder why. And I was thinking here, as I was wondering why, about the last French election that we all lived through, won by the socialist candidate François Hollande. I remembered the debate between the two candidates, Mr. Hollande and Mr. Sarkozy, and the way they addressed the public, the electorate, was very clear too that they assumed that the electorate was in some way nervous of the future, scared about things, and unhappy. Now let's look a little bit at this very beautiful country that France is. They have a very good lifestyle, a good work and life balance too. It's a very beautiful country with lots of wonderful countryside and a lovely coast as well, excellent food, wonderful wines, and by the way, France is also a popular country for foreign investment. It's very popular indeed as a tourist destination too. On top of all these huge advantages, the French have a remarkably effective and comfortable transport system, public transport system. I often take the fast trains, the TGV and the Thalys, and I find them in general to be extremely comfortable and punctual and not even particularly expensive. In fact, compared with the price of rail travel in my own country, the UK, really much better all round in France. The average life expectancy in France is now 81, and that is rather a good age. And yet, the French do seem to be awfully pessimistic. In a survey that was carried out a couple of months ago, the question was put to the French and to others as well, many other countries in fact, what are your expectations for next year? Now, out of all the countries, 50-odd countries that ran this survey, France turned out to be the most pessimistic, with the lowest of expectations of anyone. The Afghans and the Iraqis were a lot more positively disposed and optimistic than the French. Now, is this general? Perhaps if French people live in other countries, they might be more cheerful and more optimistic? Well, apparently not so. It's the same wherever they are. And there may possibly be two explanations for this. Two explanations that I'm going to look at. One is the micro explanation and one macro. First, we look at the micro one. This concerns French schools. Now, it would seem that most French children in their early childhood are happy, contented, well looked after at home, and then they go to school and everything changes dramatically. It is the schooling, therefore, that makes them unhappy. Now, I read about the experiences of a foreign journalist, a British journalist, in fact, living in Paris. He's been there for some years. He has small children. The children go to a French school. And he and his wife went to a parent teachers meeting at the school to talk to the teachers about the progress their children were making. Now, the teachers basically gave the information that the children were doing all right, there were no problems. When the parents pushed the teachers a little further to find out, well, what were the children doing perhaps particularly well, there was no response. In other words, those teachers saw their duty to point out shortcomings and difficulties only, never to give praise or to tell either children or their parents how well the children were doing. French schools are apparently an anxiety-inducing environment. And therefore, this negative outlook comes from that system and tends to perpetuate itself. You can see it in shop assistants, in bureaucrats. If you go to a bank, to a post office, you will find this same slightly unhappy attitude. Now, it may also be so that the way in which children are graded in schools also has an effect. It's competitive in France. Everybody is a rival. So rather than being given a mark, a grade, you will be placed first, second, 9th, 20th, or whatever, in order. So you're always competing with somebody else. In another survey, this is a survey now on world values, the question was put, can you trust most people? A very simple question. In the Nordic countries, 60% of respondents said yes, they could. In France, a mere 20%. In fact, it would seem that the French distrust foreigners very much. They distrust rich people. They apparently distrust British people like myself. There is a very high level of distrust all over. But what about the macro level now? Well, it's true that France has declined in its global status since the 1940s. It was once a great leading country in the world, and it isn't anymore. The same, of course, can be said for my own country, the UK. The UK was also once upon a time a great power, a world power, and it isn't anymore either. However, there is one perhaps saving grace here for the UK. The language of the world is predominantly, at the moment, English. And so, again, the French are at a disadvantage in any global debate because they cannot manage as well as English speakers. I'd like to mention one example who perhaps proves the opposite here, very much a leading figure, and that is Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the IMF. Now, Christine Lagarde is a highly successful and effective person, much praised by most people. Her success is due to her many abilities, among them her ability to speak excellent English. She has a perfect command of it. She knows how to joke in English as well. It puts her a bit ahead of many others. Now, again, looking back to those elections that we had recently, the candidates wanted to reassure the French people. They all talked of change, and perhaps that is what is needed in France after all. We all need to change, and in the present climate, that is almost certainly going to be the big challenge of the future, to change, to modernize. But I would suggest too that in the case of France, in order to give the French a chance to be a little bit less miserable and pessimistic, that they think about changing their schooling system. And they think about praising children at school as well as punishing them. That might be a start to making the French a happier and more optimistic people. Thank you.